Today we're going to be looking at chapter 9, which are sociological theories that look at critical perspectives. And so again, this is just another lens in which we can look at crime and deviance. So critical perspectives really emphasize the concept of power within a particular society as well as inequality. So think, who has the power to, define what the laws are? That would be, members of Congress and, when passing legislation. Um, and who oftentimes do those laws fall disproportionately on? And so critical perspectives became really big during the civil rights movement as well as the women's movement during the 1960s and 70s. They are also called social reaction theories. And so if we were looking at something, for instance, if we were looking at incarceration today, we might be interested in why so many African American, especially men, but women are definitely caught up in that net as well. Why so many of that people in that community have, become part of the system. And in trying to understand that, we can try to understand the laws. So as you've learned so far, when it came to the war on drugs, crack was disproportionately the punishment for crack was disproportionate to the punishment for powder cocaine, and powder cocaine was something that was consumed by whites. And so you know that story already. But if we look at the intersection of things like history, how, for instance, the history of slavery, plus things like Jim Crow, separate but equal, and then what a lot of people don't even realize is after the Emancipation Proclamation, when supposedly the slaves were supposed to be set free, there were what was called convict lease programs, and so they would be picked up for really like minor or things that probably they weren't even doing. There was still a lot of racism and things like that, and then they were leased out to those same slave owners because they needed them for the labor. Um, and so you can look at it from, that particular lens and like, hey, is this mass incarceration of African Americans actually just an extension of what we've really seen throughout history? And that is something that personally I do believe in. You don't have to believe in that. It's just for you to create that understanding. And we also know that when it comes to drugs, as you saw with the house I live in, it started with opium. And then, because the Chinese who were hard workers or hard laborers, they became criminalized for smoking opium. And so you really start to see, and the same thing with Mexican immigrants and marijuana. So you really start to see that this really wasn't about drugs. It was about access, labor, and creating that social hierarchy or structure. With the birth of our nation and how certain groups emerged as on top and others didn't do so well. And so these critical theories really help us kind of understand where some of that history comes from. Um, Karl Marx, if you've taken an intro to sociology class, is a really important figure in sociology. And he really believed that certain crimes were criminalized to keep poor in very powerless positions and to keep those in power. And if you really look at the laws and the punishment for certain laws, you will see that, white collar crime does an immense amount of damage, but it's rarely mentioned in the media. It costs society so much more than street crime. And we'll get into the details of that in a few chapters here, but it is not punished at the same rate. And so when we look at, well, who are committing these white collar crimes, and they're generally white individuals, people of a higher social standing. And it's not to say there's no punishment, but their punishment is like nowhere near as severe as, like, let's say street crime. So sometimes what happens when we apply, for instance, deterrence theory, and we find that, wow, if you're really not looking at like such a hefty punishment, maybe, taking the risk or taking the chance and committing this crime, is worth it. So would you consider, embezzling, money from your company if, for instance, you were looking at 2 years in prison or being on house arrest with an ankle bracelet, which is where a lot of white collar criminals end up. There's even differences when it comes to where they go. So generally, white collar crimes are federal crimes, and so you will end up in a federal prison, um, or and then street crimes you'll end up in the state prison. And there's a huge difference between treatment in these particular prisons. So I don't want to say it's that nice, but a lot of people have, used the term club fed as a term to describe federal prison. In that, I don't, it's not. I don't think it's a day, in the park or anything like that, but it's definitely not anywhere near as severe. Generally, there's not as much violence. They have a lot more access. I have read about, them having barbecues and, playing tennis and things like that in this club. So, or I'm sorry, prison. And so when you think about, someone like a straight criminal who goes into, a state penitentiary, obviously, you're not going to be thinking about barbecues. You're going to be thinking about survival, probably worried about, experiencing violence and things like that. So, um, uh, the social critical theories, they're really going to help us look at things like inequality and access and power, and who gets to define, what even is criminal. And generally what we find is a lot of times what's considered poor is also considered criminal. So I always give the example in class of, think about, someone sitting in a bar, drinking an $8 martini or $10 martini now, probably a lot more than that. But the homeless person sitting outside with, a 40 of whatever, in a brown paper bag, just, mere feet away from these people is committing a crime while the people inside are not. And think about it in terms of capitalism. Those people sitting inside the bar are contributing to capitalism. They are, spending a lot of money, um, to drink that martini or whatever. And so, that's also part of it. You also see, for instance, things like loitering, right? Well, who loiters? Well, generally it's homeless people, right? People who don't have a place to go. And what a lot of people don't realize is it's actually illegal to be a transient. It's illegal to be homeless. Not that they can do much about it, but that's why so many of them end up in prison anyway. But the idea of like police protecting private property, and so you really see the roots of a lot of this going back to capitalism. So the chapter objectives for chapter 9 are to appreciate the relativist definition of crime and deviance, to understand how deviant labels are imposed, to be familiar with the negative consequences of labeling, to be able to critique labeling theory based upon the text discussion and be familiar with the theory's revision and renewal, and to understand the distinction between consensus and conflict perspective in criminology. So here we're going to be discussing how deviance is relative across time and across space. And, deviance is a property of behavior, or not a property of behavior, but rather a result of how others regard the behavior. And that's why these critical theories are known as social reaction theories. So one example, just to give you, some perspective, if some of you may have been alive, but most of you probably weren't. But if you have studied in history the Vietnam War, there were a lot of people who did not agree with the Vietnam War. Even the overall public support was only about 30% at its lowest. So, I mean, that was very similar to what we saw with Iraq. The U.S. population was not behind this war, because they didn't really believe we were supposed to be there in the first place. And so think about this though, like if you were drafted to go fight, which a lot of, you had to join, you had to be part of this draft, it was actually illegal for you not to fight. And so, as you know, many people dissented and they were actually incarcerated for that. And so that's real power, right? That's your government coming in and saying, you're gonna go kill for us if we need you to, even though it's something that you don't believe in. And so that looks at, the government has a lot of power. And of course, and in some space, people did have to kill. But if I decided on my own that I needed to some type of retribution, for something that someone had done to me, and I decided to take justice into my own hands and kill someone, I would be facing, a really long sentence or possibly the death penalty. Um, and so, like as individuals, we don't have, that. amount of power to be able to, determine that, but the government does. And so there you say the exact same act, depending on, how people define it, or the power behind it, it can really mean a very different outcome, right? Maybe you might, be seen as a war hero versus, going to prison or jail or something like that. And so here we're looking, is the criminal justice system balanced, right? And a lot of this is really determined by class. And class is a really important predictor of things like, your social mobility, your likelihood of incarceration, your income and wealth throughout your lifetime, the types of schools your kids will, go to, things like that. And so generally we find, again, what's labeled as deviant is oftentimes what's considered poor. And you see this, in a lot of countries. It's not just the United States. And so next we're going to talk about one of the most famous kind of examples of the critical perspective. So a really important study was done by a man named William Chablis, and the name of the study is called The Saints and the Roughnecks. And what Chablis did was he followed two groups of boys. They're called the Saints and the Roughnecks. The Saints were a group of white, middle-income young men. The Roughnecks were minority men. Um, and both groups were engaging in like kind of primary deviance and engaging in some type of criminality. The Saints, the white kids, actually to a higher extent than the Roughnecks. What he ended up finding in his study was that even though the Saints were engaging in much harsher deviance or more extreme deviance, their labels didn't go on to kind of haunt them in their future. So they went on to become doctors and lawyers and to end up, not really having their records follow them throughout their lives. The same was not true for the Roughnecks, who again weren't engaging in the same types of deviance, but a lesser amount. And the Roughnecks were, much more likely to have their kind of criminal past follow them into their adult lives and influence, their outcomes in the larger picture. And so here we see this kind of intersection with the structure of society, the way society is set up, with that social psychology. So what ends up happening is like um, certain people are labeled as criminal, and unfortunately in our country, it's African American males, and I'd say in general African Americans as well as Latinos. I think there's definitely a stigma with Latinos. But they're labeled that. People start to see them as that, and what even can happen is people will internalize how others see them, and what's known as the amplification of violence or evil. It's like, oh, you think I'm a bad person? I'm going to show you what a bad person is, because we really will internalize how people like see us, right? And so this happens both informally with maybe someone shoplifting or them being followed and then getting pulled over or whatever, but also officially, like when records are made and these people enter into the system. And here this is what's known as labeling theory, which we'll talk about in a second. But once you're labeled and put into the criminal justice system, we know in regards to deterrence, either you it scares you a lot, or you really internalize this view, and you're like, yeah, I'm a criminal, I'm a badass, right? And now I'm going to show you how badass I am. And so they really internalize their labels, especially since that's how people are always seeing them. All right, so kind of continuing with those ideas of labeling theory, we talked about primary deviance, and in some sense, like, a lot of kids engage in primary deviance, things like drinking or maybe experimenting with drugs or shoplifting or whatever. Um, but what ends up happening is what's known as secondary deviance, and what happens with secondary deviance is it occurs when someone is caught and labeled. What happens with this is that after they're caught and labeled, and it's like, look at this kid here in the picture, right? So I live in his neighborhood, and I found out that he was caught burglarizing a home. Guess what's going to happen the next time a home is burglarized, right? Whose eyes are they going to shoot at? It's going to be this kid. So even though maybe he didn't do it the second time, these types of people will continually be accused on things just based on one occurrence. On a larger scale, this can lead to things like even legal discrimination. So, for instance, we know that because of certain stigmas that maybe even the African Americans or Latinos face, maybe they won't, be able to get a job because, they're associated with being criminals. There's a really interesting study where they actually found that whites with criminal records were more likely to get jobs than blacks without criminal records, and it's really based on that idea of association, right? That those stigmas are associated with people even though they hadn't even done anything. And it's just really hard, for us to imagine, but it's real, right? And this happens in all different types of ways. So things like maybe job applications, even we know, so for certain individuals that have Pan-African names or even Latino names. There was a study where a guy changed his name from Jose to Joe, and Joe got a lot more callbacks with his job application than when he called himself Jose. And so a lot of that is just based on stigma, um, people's expectations based on, that social psychology. And so this can influence, a jury in the same way. There are all types of structural injustices and inequalities that, just because of stigma people will face. And because, something like skin color, you can't get rid of that. Um, so even though you haven't, engaged in this type of criminality, sometimes you are likely to um, still experience it. And you can imagine, if you were pulled over multiple times as a black male, and taken out of your car, sat on the curb. And when I lived in Southern California, I saw this a lot. And every time I looked down to see who was sitting on the curb, it was not a white woman. It was generally minority men who were out there. And again, I don't know the specifics of those cases, but I'm assuming not everyone has stuff in their car. It's like who they decide to search just based on, probable cause or what they think. So labeling theory really challenges deterrence theory. So again, if the offender perceives a risk of arrest, it will deter and not enhance the criminal behavior. But once it's gone on to official labeling, sometimes it leads to that deviant amplification, which is what we also notice. So another layer to this idea, before we get on to the critiques of labeling theory, is shaming. And there's what's known as disintegrative shaming and reintegrative shaming. And so disintegrative shaming is treating someone like an outcast, which generally makes them more deviant. So to give you an example, think about someone who goes into the penitentiary. Now you have to, for the most part, you have to mark that you're a convicted felon on every job application. You can no longer get student loans. You can no longer serve on a jury. For most people, they lose their right to vote. Um, and so, like we've definitely really kind of pushed you out of onto the kind of outskirts because who's going to hire an ex-felon? Not to say that they can't get hired, but it's going to be a lot more difficult, especially in a time of economic trouble, right? So, we can understand how what happens is like, and then, lawful people are like, oh, you're an ex-felon? I don't want to hang out with you. Um, Imagine you're on a blind date. That's one of the things they tell you. What are you going to do? Most of you are going to run, right? And so you see all of the like lawful people running away from these people, not wanting to be part of it. And we can, it's just a matter of, it's easy to understand why people end up back into the system, reoffending again, or ending up even more deviant than they did to begin with. So let's look at some of the critiques of labeling theory. Their first critique of labeling theory is that research fails to consistently support its arguments. So research on labeling theory is pretty mixed because we don't really know if it's um, the the label or if it's that the official punishment reduces things like your unemployment or your chances for being successful in school, like we said, because you're not getting help. There's another idea that the labeling theory is overly passive view of an individual, kind of saying that, hey, doesn't this person play, hey, they did a crime, or didn't they play, they have their own kind of role in this. It's not just society's reactions randomly. This doesn't happen to every single, African American male. It also fails to explain primary deviance. So if it was the label that caused people to be deviant, then they didn't have the label when they first started to do it. So, kind of the chicken or the egg question. You can't say it was a labeling theory if, they didn't have the label before that primary deviance. And then it also kind of ignores crimes by the powerful, which we talked about, as well as um, family and peer influences. So, what about the fact of, who these people are hanging out with, growing up with, stuff like that. So within critical perspectives, we have two major viewpoints. The first one is the consensus view. And the consensus view states that social institutions help create social stability. If you've taken an intro to sociology class, a consensus view would be aligned most with functionalist view, meaning essentially, hey, things run pretty well. Yeah, there are some instances of dysfunction, but overall, all of our social systems and institutions are really there to help social stability, right? The criminal justice system is doing the right thing. The conflict view, on the contrary, says that social institutions are there to serve the interests of the powerful, and that laws really reflect the interests of the ruling class, that they're really structured to look fair, but they're not. And so I'm sure you could probably think of many laws that maybe you don't seem as fair. Something as silly as, gambling, it's obviously illegal. Like, you're not even supposed to really gamble, play poker with your friends for quarters. Like, that's technically illegal. But if you go and buy a lottery ticket, that's totally legal. And think about who's kind of the middleman in that. It's the government, right? They're getting a lot of the funds that you are, investing in this. Same thing with, Vegas or something like that, right? It's totally illegal to gamble, unless you're in a casino. Um, Even the legal prostitution in some counties in Nevada, similar, right? Now the government or the state just has its hand in, skimming off the top of like those funds. So consensus view says that, yeah, most people really agree with, what's going on. Conflict says no, actually there's some real problems and some real inequalities, and those need to be, assessed. All right, next we're going to look at a few particular theorists within the critical perspective. The first one is Karl Marx. I mentioned him earlier, and he coined the term conflict perspective. And conflict perspective, Marx was really focusing his studies on class. And he said, ultimately they were the owners of production, or people who owned things like the the mental production, people like the media, newspapers, the ruling ideas, and things like that. And then there were the bourgeoisies, and the bourgeoisie were the workers. And essentially, he believed that both groups were in constant struggle or tension with each other, that each group is trying to maximize their resources. And so, if you envision your bosses of a big company, for instance, as the bourgeoisie, you are the worker bee, you are the proletariat, and so you're trying to get a raise. They're like, nah, we don't want to give you a raise. You're trying to get more benefits, right? And so there's this kind of tension. Both of you guys are trying to maximize. You both want to make as much money as possible. They want to utilize you for probably the least amount as possible. So Marx ultimately believed that the bourgeoisie were very exploitative, that they would be exploiting labor, and that the proletariat would need to overthrow the ruling class, and we would have to kind of start all over. And again, if you know anything about Marx, his solution to this was socialism. So the next theorist we'll look at was Turk's theory of criminalization. And Turk essentially said that crime is a label imposed on the powerless as part of a larger struggle for political power. I think the best representation or example in regards to this theory of criminalization in regards to politics is the idea that we take away the right to vote from convicted felons. We are one of the only nations in the world that does this. And I think, a lot of the time, stuff we're voting on is stuff that will directly impact people in the system. Also, you are no longer allowed to serve on a jury. And so, really, when you're taking away that kind of political representation, if you think about, such a large proportion of African American males being put into the system at some point in their life and then losing that right to vote, that's a big chunk of the vote that's, no longer there. And of course, that's benefiting certain groups of people. And so, you know, it's definitely there's definitely some conflict and some inequality in that. And you can see how it reflects the larger pictures in regards to who gets elected. Next, we'll look at Sellin's culture conflict, and Sellin essentially just said that cultures are different. And so, like, what's criminal in one culture is not criminal in another. One example I can give you of this is when I used to work in a restaurant, I worked in the kitchen, and there were obviously a lot of Mexican immigrants that were working. That's generally, especially in Southern California, who's working in the back of the kitchens. And I remember one day, some of the other restaurant staff found out that this guy Jose, who he was probably about, I don't know, 25 at the time. They found out that his wife was, I think, like 17 or something like that. And they were, really concerned about this, that, this older male was actually married to such a woman so young. But looking at the broader kind of scheme of things in Mexico, that's really not that uncommon. It's not criminal. And so, I think these people were only looking at it from their own kind of viewpoint or own perspective. Oh, you were a pedophile. Well, no, actually not. There's just a difference in culture, and that was very, very normal um, from a Mexican culture. So it just gives you some examples there. Lastly, we have Vold's group conflicts, and essentially he said that crime would emerge because of tension between groups. So some examples of this: we've definitely seen a lot of violence between pro-life and pro-choice groups. We even see violence between Republicans and Democrats. There have been not politicians, well, sometimes, but not politicians specifically, but between people who identify as Republican or Democrat. If you remember, Gabby Giffords was shot in the face, right? She was a Democratic congresswoman, and so you'll definitely see tension and crime emerge from differences in group kind of dynamics. All right, so let's look at some of the radical theories in criminology. Again, bringing up Marx, and Engels was his protege, someone he worked very, very closely with throughout his lives. Marx and Engels essentially said laws help the ruling class by placing importance on personal property and giving the appearance of equal justice. So again, this whole idea of how capitalism contributes to crime. The idea that, for instance, police officers will oftentimes guard, property. They'll guard businesses without really maybe giving individuals the same type of protections. As we talked about before, things like no trespassing on private property, that would be, it would be unlawful to do so. So that idea that, the laws were really set up to kind of keep the appearance of everything justice, but, allowing for kind of capitalism to play itself out. Marx and Engels also saw crime as a political rebellion. Okay, so the next one we'll look at is Bonger capitalism and egoism. I always really liked this theory. I think it really makes a lot of sense. So when you think about capitalism, within the United States and capitalism, we see what's known as rugged individualism, the idea of everyone kind of in it on their own. Even so much, sometimes you see families kind of not even being like cohesive, and everyone's really in it on their own. And Bonga really believed that capitalism led to egoism, right? It led to this idea of like just being kind of fulfilling, right? You're just trying to create your own kind of livelihood and the counter to that is altruism, is what's doing what's right for the group. And this isn't anything inherent within human behavior. There are many cultures, especially like Asian cultures, and you can see representations of this in the United States as well, just in family dynamics. But if you look at Latino, Black, and Asian families, generally they are much more collectivistic, which means that they are doing what's good for the group as opposed to what's good for the individual. You don't see this within white families as much. Um, so just to give you an example, most Latino families or Black families will not put their loved ones into like senior living facilities or something like that. So even though they have less resources overall, they fundamentally figure out a way to take care of their elders. Um, and with that, Fonger really said that capitalism promoted egoism. When everything is based on money, things you get more of a hierarchy, and people seem to think sometimes like, oh, I really earned this without understanding that there are probably a lot of different kind of complexities that help them, enter into the positions that they held, right? Anyone can do this, I can do this. We're not going to cover Hall. It's not a big one. And then lastly, Chablis and vagrancy laws. So during Chablis' time, it was, like I said, it still is, but we had things like vagrancy laws. And when the population was a lot smaller, you can understand that if and it has it relates to capitalism, that if there were vagrancy laws, which meant that you were not allowed to be a vagrant, you were not allowed to be essentially homeless, then it would essentially force everybody into the workforce. This would push wages down because if like economics 101, right, the more people you have in the labor pool, the less they have to pay because they can just find your replacement really easily. And so that would really help wages stay down. And I always thought that was a really, really interesting theory as well. All right, so next we're going to cover some of the feminist perspectives. And feminist perspectives really look to see, a feminist believes in equality between males and females, but there are different branches of feminism that see, where are the root causes for inequality between the sexes. So the first type of feminism that we will cover is liberal feminism, and liberal feminists really believe that it's in the socialization process that men and women are socialized into different roles, and those roles are really unequal. So, with men being the breadwinners and women being the homemakers, it's the men who fundamentally are the ones who are taking home the paychecks and getting to decide, how that money is spent, and oftentimes leaving women dependent on males in the same light. And so, the next one we'll look at is Marxist feminists. Marxist feminism says that women are forced to commit crime in a capitalistic society because capitalism really leaves women dependent on males. And so if you think about, for instance, something like prostitution, right? Men, as we mentioned, being maybe the breadwinners for the most part, having more money, and we know they do, absolutely. Even in every single job, I just researched this. Every single job listed by the Bureau of Labor, there were only 4 jobs in which women made more. And in those few 4 jobs, it was like just slightly. I mean, I don't know if we could even say it was more. It was just like a tiny bit more. There was not one job where women were making more, even in female centered jobs like nursing or teaching. Actually, male nurses make a lot more than female nurses, and male teachers make more money than female teachers. And so he really believed that women were forced to commit crime within capitalism because they were fundamentally there were such inequality in regards to that distribution of resources or money. Um, Radical feminism is very similar to Marxist feminism, so I'm not going to go over that. Socialist feminism, on the other hand, sees a combination of both capitalism and patriarchy as equally important. So socialist feminists really saw violence as a way for men to dominate over women. So they see it very similar to Marx, but also believe that there's that intersection with patriarchy, as well as that socialization process that leaves men or women more dependent on men. And then lastly, we have multicultural feminism. And multicultural feminism really stresses the importance of things like race and ethnicity. Sometimes this is known as the intersection of, things like race and ethnicity and how that affects women's opportunities. And so historically, feminism has been a white kind of branch of study, but what multicultural feminism has done has really, recognized that actually, minority women have a very different experience than white women. And that's very even true, like with those wages. So women are making about 77 cents to the dollar right now, but Black women and Latino women make even less. And so, again, I'm trying to understand kind of the complexities involved in that. All right. So lastly, we're just going to cover kind of the scope of feminist theory, and I urge you to kind of research this a little bit more. It's really intriguing and interesting. So the first thing we'll kind of discuss is the victimization of women. So we know that women who are abused are more likely to break the law. Think like runaways. Women who run away within a few years are much more likely to become prostitutes. And even we know, for instance, the majority of prostitutes have experienced some kind of sexual abuse in their past. And again, what happens oftentimes is women who are abused will start to see their only value in their sex, because they haven't really been taught any different. So those who suffer sexual abuse are much more likely to engage in those sexual crimes as well. Um, The next one is gender differences in crime. So trying to understand that. We can look back at the socialization. And if you're not familiar with socialization, if you haven't taken an intro class, it's this like everyday interaction of how we become who we are. And we are, socialized into our gender roles. Probably happens before you're even born, when your parents have decorated your room and have all of these outfits for you to wear, usually blue and usually pink. And so that gender socialization, socializes women to be more nurturing, things like playing house and giving baby dolls and things like that. And there's the socialization for males to be more violent. So we give them swords and guns and everything else. I think I've mentioned that before. This also provides an explanation for women's criminality, because we know that women will use sex to engage in crime. There's a really good old Seinfeld episode where George Costanza meets a woman on the subway, and she flirts with him, and they end up in a hotel room, and she wants to get kinky, so she handcuffs him to the bed, and then she steals his wallet. Um, but so this is just an example of how women, a woman might use her sexuality to commit a crime. If you remember Eileen Warnos, one of the only female serial killers, she began as a prostitute and was abused by many of the Johns, but she ended up killing the Johns and just taking their money. So she was using her sexuality, so she'd, you know, try to get them to go with her, and then would kill them, take their money. So um, let's see. And then, in regards to males, we know that when it comes to crime, males, are more violent and use more force. So lastly, looking at women in the criminal justice system, we know that many women inmates face abuse, but even by people like their lawyers, really sad, by police officers, prison guards, um, and oftentimes will face discrimination even when they play these roles. Um, and so I remember as a student I did a project of women behind bars. I've always been really interested in it, and actually, just a little side note. When I visited the Chino Women's Institute years ago, I have to say it was one of the most interesting things I have ever experienced. It was very different than the male prison. The dynamics were completely different. It was a lot more easygoing, or it seemed to be. Anyways, but what was I gonna say now? I just lost my train of thought. Oh, see, it happens on video too. So, anyways, we just know that inmates face more abuses, and then women working within the system face a lot more discrimination and abuse as well. So that is the end of our chapter. This is chapter 8, 9. Okay,